was awarded the Turing Award as well as an invitation to the National Membership of Engineering. He is currently working on a very important bill that's making its way through Congress right now called HR 3564, which he will speak a bit more about today. And Marty also has a really unique vision on solving the nuclear threat, then turns over to solving AI and climate. And so we're here today to learn a little bit more about the work Marty's doing, and he will also share with you different aspirations and hopes that he has.
Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, is famous as having said that that he believes the risk of war was somewhere between 1 and 3 and even. Now, I'm not saying he was right, but if he was saying that the Cuban Missile Crisis was equivalent to playing nuclear roulette, which, by the way, is the title of Jeffrey Goldberg's paper and a term I used repeatedly in that 1985 paper. It's equivalent to playing nuclear roulette, which is a global version of Russian roulette, with a 2 or 3 chambered revolver. Now, most of the times, like the war in Ukraine, has many fewer chambers. It probably only has, actually might have 2. I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's say it has 600 chambers. It doesn't matter. If you keep pulling the trigger in Russian roulette, what's going to happen?
You're going to die.
Right. It's not a question of if you're going to die. It's only a question of when. And so this is both the positive and the negative. I published the paper that Jeffrey Goldberg quoted from was called On the Inevitability and Prevention of Nuclear War. And you can download it from my Stanford website if you can tell them how to get it. And I read that paper recently. I still agree with most of it. In fact, almost all of it. So we need to do something. I mean, this is a horrible risk, but it's a great opportunity at the same time. I believe it's the chasm between the physical power that technology has given humanity and the, at best, irresponsible, and I should add that word because you're all roughly 16 years old. So I usually just say I try to remember to say an irresponsible 16-year-old and an irresponsible adolescent. So I assume you are all responsible adolescents. But the problem is the chasm between the godlike physical power that technology has given us. Like in the Bible, who could destroy Sodom and Gomorrah with thunderbolts? Only God. What do we call them today? Nuclear weapons. You saw that house. We saw what happened to it. It was horrible. And that was over almost a mile away from ground zero and a small nuclear weapon. Up till now, you may be feeling somewhat discouraged, but there's a lot of hope. Now, we can't stay where we are. We can't jump to where we need to go, because if we said the brotherhood of man, world peace, what would you say about that? Ain't going to happen. And it's not going to happen in the current environment. But we have to do something that approximates that, not exactly that, but something that approximates that, or we're not going to survive. If we'll do that, we'll solve not only the nuclear threat, we'll solve artificial intelligence, any threat that it poses, climate change, and more. We can't solve any of those problems in the current world environment. There's too much war, too much hatred, too much adversarial relationship. Now, part of the solution is diplomacy. How many of you would like to be diplomats? Yeah, you can. Well, maybe might want to be diplomats. Okay. I know that when I talked to League of Creative Minds about 5-6 years ago, many of the people wanted to be diplomats, go into the Foreign Service. Today, under Trump, that's a little bit more questionable because you have to support American foreign policy. There's a problem with the way we exercise diplomacy. One of the readings I gave you was just the headline of an article, and I'll read you the headline. Diplomacy is critical to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, DoD official says. Well, let's see. What would denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula mean? Would we have to get rid of any nuclear weapons?
No.
Would North Korea have to get rid of any nuclear
Yes.
weapons? All of them. Yeah, so denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a nice way of saying unilateral nuclear disarmament on North Korea's part. Now, it'd be nice if they do that, but that's wishful thinking. That's not reality. They're not that stupid. They're not that naive. And so we need to base diplomacy on reality, and yet right now we're basing diplomacy with North Korea on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That's a mistake. I'm not saying we should let them keep their weapons, but we can't take them away from them without a war, and they could devastate Seoul even with conventional weapons, much less nuclear. So we need to base diplomacy on reality. To solve this problem, we're going to have to build a more peaceful world. We're going to have to build a world where we could not attack Iran, where Iran would not be run by Ayatollahs. And I admit that right now it's hard to see how we could build that world. But we can start, and I'll tell you one thing that could help start that. H.R. 3654, which is a bill, and you can send them the links to the, you can send them the one-page explanation. This is a bill that I've been working on for several years with Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, and Admiral Bobby Inman, who actually even your parents probably never heard of. But he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense in 1994, withdrew his name. He was director of NSA. Actually, Ben knows him, who he is, because Ben worked in cryptography. Admiral Inman was director of NSA and wanted to throw me in jail 45 years ago for publishing my papers in cryptography. Now he's a good friend, and he'll sign letters that he agrees with. And so the good news is Scott Peters, a congressman from California's 50th Congressional District down in San Diego, has introduced a bill, and I've been able to get 23 co-sponsors for it. It's up to 23 because we had 21 a week ago, but just last Friday, Susie Lee of Nevada and Gabe Vasquez of New Mexico signed on, and we got up to 23. And what we're working toward is passing this bill. And it's not that impossible to get a meeting with your congressman. All the time you hear, write a letter to your congressman. Yeah, that helps. But a meeting makes a big, big difference. And what I propose you do is go for, and you have how to do that, right? What I suggest you do is first go and try to get a mayor, a city councilman, city councilwoman, someone like that interested in this issue who knows the member of Congress. Then get that person to approach the member of Congress asking for the meeting. Now, I'm fortunate. I know Rose Gottemoeller, who was the Obama's chief negotiator for the New START Treaty. I know Tom Finger, who was the chairman of the National Intelligence Council. So I was able to get them to join the meeting with Sam Ricardo. He didn't know they were going to be there, but they were there. It helped move it up on his radar screen. But again, I think you can do similar things. And if you get a meeting like that, let me know. And I'll ask Rose if she can come. I'll ask Tom if he can come. I shouldn't ask Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, because his health is suffering. But so that's what you can do. And we have a great opportunity. If you think about this, how old are you?
I'm 12.
He's 12. When did a 12-year-old have a chance to save the world? You do. It's just a small piece. But just like me, just a small piece, but we have to do our part. So I hope you'll do that, and I will now take questions.
If nothing isn't done to stop the nuclear crisis that's ongoing right now, when do you think the end of the world will be?
No one knows when it'll happen. It's a random event, and it could have happened in 1962. Thank God it didn't. It could have happened in 1999. Thank God it didn't. So by the way, there you had two high-ranking NATO officers, one an American 3-star general, one a British 2-star general. They disagreed. One thought they should take action that the other thought might start World War III. What is the probability, roughly speaking, that you'd have two people who would think that they should do that? Roughly 25%, 50% times squared. It's really bad. We need to do something about this, and we can do something about this.
If you don't mind me asking, will you endorse in California's governor race?
I don't. I'll go with whoever wins the primary. And the Republican. By the way, Schwarzenegger was a good governor, even though he was a Republican. I was against the recall of Gray Davis, which led to Schwarzenegger being governor, but he did a good job. And Trump, I point out to candidates in swing districts when I talk to them, I say, one thing you can do to prove that you're not a dogmatic Democrat, because they've got to prove that to the Republicans and the independents in the district, is you can point out that Trump, while he deserves a lot of criticism, has done some good things. In particular, how many nuclear tests has North Korea done since the Singapore summit? 0. And what do we say about the Singapore summit? Trump got nothing out of that. That's not nothing. Now, there are other reasons why they haven't tested, and they might start testing again. They've done a lot of missile tests. but that's not nothing.
I was wondering if you could give us like a short rundown of HR 3564, like in your own words.
Sure. HR 3564, I think it's called the Nuclear First Strike Security Act or something like that. And it says that no money appropriated by the Congress, because that's how Congress always gets things done, can be used for a nuclear first strike, and it defines nuclear first strike, which is pretty obvious what it is, against the United States or one of our allies, and it names a number of countries, and there's questions as to whether some other countries should be in there, but we'll leave that out. Unless the Secretary of Defense has certified the order as valid and legal. And it requires that the certification of the order as valid and legal be done within 7 days of the strike. So that prevents the President from saying to the Secretary of Defense nominee, hey, look, I'll nominate you to SecDef, but you've got to give me this letter that says anytime I issue an order, it's valid. So he can't do that, because it's got to be within 7 days. Now, what's to prevent me, let's say I'm the President of the United States, from saying to somebody I want to be SecDef, Secretary of Defense, well, just issue me an order every 7 days. Well, the bill has wording in it that requires that the minority and majority leaders in the House and the Senate are notified whenever such a finding is made. So if the Secretary of Defense would issue a routine every 7 days finding that it's valid, the order is legal and valid, right now the Democrats would be up in arms saying that Trump is not following the spirit of the law. There is an exception for launch on warning, which I mentioned, which has to be in there, because now there have been errors in the warning system. That's why I don't think it should be in there, but it has to be in there so that the President can respond in that situation. So this is an imperfect bill, but it's a great first step. And we need to think of it as a step in a process, not we can't solve the problem all at once. Getting rid of the weapons would not solve the problem.
So within the bill, is there any way to make it so it's not the Secretary of Defense who has to issue that sign-off as a guardrail, and instead someone else to make it like?
Yeah, good question. I spoke with, originally it was the Speaker of the House, because I felt that it says Congress should declare war, and if a nuclear first strike is not a declaration of war, I don't know what is. But I spoke with Matt Waxman, who's an expert on executive authority under constitutional law at Columbia University, and he had written a paper, in fact, on this with someone else, where they recommended it be the Secretary of Defense and I think the Secretary of State. And he said, no, it has to be within the executive branch. And I don't fully understand why that's the case. And so no matter who it is in the executive branch, Trump right now is going to have control over him or her. So it's imperfect, but it's passable. It's a first step, and it brings into focus for the American public that the President has that ability, which most people don't realize.
I'm really surprised that the President has all the executive power, especially since it was supposed to be balanced when they assigned the 3 branches, but they put all of the actual war power onto the President, who I don't think has more experience in war than the Congress and has better decision making than them. So I'm curious to know what you think about the President having all this power. And I think we don't put enough stress on war, because while politics is important and the judicial branch is important, what actually starts a war with a country is launching a nuke, which a president can do.
And it wasn't just Trump. It was Biden. It was Obama. Every president in recent history has done it. We're on a war footing as a nation, which we should not be. And this bill is an attempt for Congress to not only assert itself with respect to nuclear weapons, but to assert itself with respect to the war-making capabilities. And Tim Kaine, you probably don't know this, but Tim Kaine, who's the senator from Virginia, he was the vice presidential candidate with Hillary Clinton. He required Obama to submit the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, to Congress for approval, not as a treaty, but just for approval. And because he felt that Congress needed to weigh in on this matter. And he was going to introduce a companion bill in the Senate, except I recently got an email from his chief of staff saying that Tim is the point person on Iran and a whole bunch of other things, and he just doesn't have time. He'll co-sponsor, but he cannot sponsor himself.
Yes, I was just wondering what you think would be like the aftermath of a nuclear war, if anyone would survive.
I don't know. And there are some people who say nuclear winter would not happen. that the number of weapons has come down to the point where it wouldn't happen. Other people say no, it would. And I've talked to a friend, there's a guy who's a friend of mine. He was chief scientist at DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Actually, he was chief scientist of what's called the Advanced Systems Concept Office, which was its premier office. The way I came in contact with him is interesting. I was reading the newspaper, and I had never heard of DTRA, which I suspect many of you haven't either. And I said, oh, they should be interested in knowing what the risk of a nuclear war is. They probably aren't, but they should be. And so I made some phone calls, and eventually I found Jim Skouras as his name, and became friendly with him. And he was going to try to do something along these lines, except he was unable to. Jim says that the nuclear winter studies, which show that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan would result in roughly 1 billion deaths, which has been published in Scientific American. He says that there's a lot of uncertainty in one of the key parameters in that study. And I haven't looked at it enough to know whether he's right or wrong, but I know he's pretty good. So I don't know. The bottom line is I don't know the answer, but I don't want to do the experiment to find out.
Could you explain the launch on warning scenario?
What is the launch on warning?
And then also, why are you against that as a
Sure.
part of the bill?
So launch on warning, we have a warning system, which is a bunch of radars and satellites and other things like that. And if they show that a large number of incoming ICBMs is going to hit the United States, the president might launch on warning. He might launch our land-based ICBMs before they're taken out by these incoming ICBMs. Now, we still have the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which many people, myself included, believe should be our only deterrent. That the land-based ICBMs are a disaster waiting to happen. Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, has said this, so it's not just me. But there are people within the nuclear establishment who like the ICBMs. There's an ICBM caucus in the Senate, and they maintain that it's not because they're from states that benefit financially from the ICBMs, that have bases, but that's probably the reason they are part of the ICBM caucus. So that's the launch on warning scenario, is that we see a bunch of missiles coming our way, we launch on warning even before they've had a chance to do their damage. Why do I not like that? There have been mistakes in the launch in the warning system. Bill Perry was awakened at 4 a.m., I think 3 or 4 a.m. one morning when he was Assistant Secretary. He was number 2 person, I think, in the Pentagon. He was not the Secretary of Defense. It turned out it was a training tape that had been mounted by accident. Another time that someone was awakened in the middle of the night, it was a computer chip that had failed. Another time, there's a colonel in the former Soviet Army, Colonel Petrov, who's called the man who saved the world. And I don't know, some of you may have heard of him. There was a Soviet warning system in the 80s that detected a large number. It detected, not a large number, it detected a few ICBMs coming their way. And he did not pass the warning up the chain of command as he was supposed to, because he said he had a gut sense that it was a false alarm, which it turned out to be. That's why I don't like launch on warning. Too many false alarms, too much danger. And we have the submarines that we should depend on.
I was wondering, where would the U.S. launch to if they're not exactly sure, where all the things are coming from?
If they're coming from land, it's easy to know where they're coming from. If they're coming from a submarine, you have no way of knowing who they're coming from, unless you've been able to track a country's submarine. So this is a real problem with not only launch on warning, but deterrence in general. You hit a very good point.
What feedback have you gotten on your bill so far?
I haven't talked about it a lot. And then when I go to China, for example, I talk very quietly with a few people, and I tell them, don't bring this up in the Chinese government. The worst thing that could happen is for the Chinese government to say we think it's a good thing, because then Americans would use it against us. I mean, that shouldn't be, but it is. And so I've gotten, several people have told me, who would be against this? I mean, it's such a weak bill. Who would be against it? And yet, if it starts to get traction, the nuclear establishment, as I call it, although you pointed out last night I shouldn't call it the nuclear establishment. What would you call it? It's the people who love nuclear deterrence, who think nuclear deterrence is the best thing since sliced bread. And they're not bad people. They honestly believe what they think, but they're wrong in my conviction, not just my opinion. They're operating from an old mode of thinking, which isn't going to work. And we suffered from this in World War II. At the beginning of World War II, what did the admirals want? Battleships, because that's what won World War I. What do they really need? Aircraft carriers. It's often said that generals are fighting the next war the way they fought the last war. We need to think different. You can't have World War III. World War III would be the end of civilization as we know it.
Thank you so much for your time and presenting to us all of the amazing work you've done. I was wondering, this is more of a general question, but what got you to this point? Like, what did your work career look
Sure.
like?
How did I move from cybersecurity to international security? The waypoint was marital security. 40 some odd years ago, roughly 45 years ago, my wife was ready to leave me, but I didn't know it because I had blinders on the way many spouses, especially husbands, do. And she decided she wasn't going to leave me. Life with me was no picnic. Life with her wasn't great either. And the good news is not only have we saved our marriage, but we haven't had a fight in 20 years. Yes. Now, this was beyond my comprehension. I grew up in the New York Jewish culture. Dorothy did not. The first thing that happened when she met my parents, guess what? They were fighting. They didn't regard it as fighting, but they were fighting. And so I actually think that we wrote a book about this, which you can also download for free. I mentioned the Afghan section, but most of it's about personal relationships. And the same things that are needed at the personal level, because you get into these things where person A does one thing, person B does another, and you just keep going round and round. And the same thing happens internationally, which is why the subtitle of the book is Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet, because the two really go together. And I can't point to one nuclear weapon I've eliminated. I can't point to one war I've stopped, although I keep giving talks like this, trying to. But my life is better every day because I don't fight with my wife. Because when she looks daggers at me, instead of getting mad at her, I say what I said. And by the way, I've done the same thing to her. So we have to learn to love ourselves. The Bible says love your neighbor as yourself. It left out an important part. You have to learn to love yourself. Most people hate their neighbors the way they hate themselves, except they won't face that that's what's happening. So that's how I came to this.
I'm really interested in both the public perceptions and the perceptions that we have in government. How do you think those have kind of shaped, the public stance on nuclear weapons and nuclear war?
And I think government is more concerned with other things. There's an almost closed feedback loop between the general public, the media, and politicians. The politicians can't get ahead of the public. There's an apocryphal story that a French politician of 1850 roughly said, "There go the people." There was a riot in Paris. "There go the people. I must follow them, for I am their leader," which is kind of a joke, but it's true. The politicians can't get ahead of the general public or they're voted out of office. The general public can't get ahead of the media because that's where they get their information. The media can't get ahead of the general public or the people stop buying or listening to their news, and they can't get ahead of the politicians because they're the ones that they cover. But each one of those points in a seemingly closed feedback loop is a possible entry point. When I worked with Beyond War, as the group was called, in the 80s, we had a huge grassroots movement. We had 20,000 people working actively on this issue. Then we could work at the personal level, at the general public level.
One question I had, Martin, you mentioned that Iran hasn't done anything yet. Do you think that they will, and do you think that things will keep escalating?
When the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was first announced, did I say this already? I went into Tom Finger's office and I asked him I didn't. I asked him what he thought of the military option with respect to Iran, because that was the only alternative really to diplomacy. And what he said was, one of the few things that could convince Iranians to build a nuclear weapon, there were some who wanted to, there were some who didn't want to. One of the few things that could coalesce Iranian public opinion around the need to build a nuclear weapon was if America were to attack them. So I think I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but 10 years from now, I'm afraid to see what the world will look like if I'm around. We're making mistakes, making a lot of mistakes. I work with J Street, which some of you may have heard of. It's a predominantly Jewish organization it calls itself pro-Israel, pro-peace. And what I add to that is that you cannot be pro-Israel in the long run without being pro-peace, because Israel cannot maintain military superiority forever. It needs to make use of this limited period of time, probably measured in decades, when it does have that advantage, to experiment with different partners and to make the best peace deal it can. Instead, it's not doing any of those things. Under Netanyahu, he's trying to stay out of jail. And they're in an old approach. And the approach they're using is, I have sympathy with it, I understand it, but it's wrong. I was there 40 years ago. Israel was my get out of concentration camp free card, which I've said to some of you. I was born in October 45, just after World War II ended, the Holocaust had happened, and there was a boatload of Jews that came to New York Harbor in 1939 that was turned away because they didn't have visas. They went sent back to Germany, and you can imagine what happened to them. Israel was my get out of concentration camp free card. If ever that happened here, I could always go to Israel because they would accept me. 1981, there's a story in the book where I was fortunate enough to realize that was my 5-year-old self had reached that conclusion and that I needed to re-examine that. And I concluded there were much greater dangers to my physical existence than resurgent Nazism in this country, like nuclear weapons, and I needed to be doing something about that.
You connected progress on your bill and other positive steps that way with then the ability to solve other challenges like climate change and AI. Since some of the students were interested in climate change as well, could you describe that connection that you see?
I mean, we weren't even going to solve it under Biden. We're certainly not going to solve it under Trump. There's too much hatred, too much anger, too much adversarial, there are too many adversarial relationships in the world to really get together and work together to solve a problem. If we could develop that, if we could recognize that human survival depends on countries working together, then we would solve all of those problems, I am convinced.
What is your opinion on the nuclear as a power source as opposed to as a weapon? Do you believe that it should be restricted more or it should be like expanded?
Okay, I'll try to take that question. So I always say is whether you're for or against nuclear power, everyone's against having irresponsible 16-year-olds run a nuclear power plant, right? Not responsible 16-year-olds, irresponsible 16-year-olds. Unfortunately, right now, with quarter-to-quarter mentality governing utility companies, they're behaving like irresponsible 16-year-olds. When Fukushima, which you may have heard of, when Fukushima melted down, TEPCO ordered the manager of the plant not to flood it with seawater. He knew it was toast because they were trying to save a multi-billion-dollar investment. He knew it was melted down anyway, and he flooded it with seawater against orders. He was responsible, thank God. But the management in Tokyo was acting like a bunch of irresponsible 16-year-olds with a quarter-to-quarter mentality. So that's what I say about nuclear power. And I won't take a position for or against it because I'm going to lose half the audience either way.
Do you believe that nuclear power is too cruel of a force to be put in human hands?
Right now it is because we're acting like a bunch of irresponsible 16-year-olds, and you wouldn't give them control of a nuclear power plant. So no, we shouldn't. I don't think we should be building nuclear power plants until we become mature, and we can then make decisions based on that maturity. But we're probably going to build them anyway because they're clean. People totally forget what happened, what we said in the 70s and 80s. Now it's all about carbon dioxide.
My question just kind of broadly pertains to the global impact of HR 3564. If this bill was actually signed into law in the United States, I was just wondering, do you think this could have a global impact for other governments, other nuclear states to also implement similar?
Okay. Some states don't need an HR 3564. Like China, we don't know for sure, but they maintain that they do not mate their nuclear weapons with their missiles until there's a crisis. And so, whereas we have our weapons ready to fire on a moment's notice 24/7. So we need it, they probably don't. A French president, I think it was Mitterrand, wrote in his memoirs, that when he was president, if there had been a nuclear war, he would not have ordered a retaliatory strike. Because what's the point? Deterrence has failed. The French military establishment was mad as hell at him for saying that.
I was wondering, you said that the bill was like a good first step, but what would you say are like future steps after, if the bill was passed, like to raise awareness about the gravity of the situation with nuclear weapons and other?
I'm focused on trying to pass this bill. Then we'll see if it produces a public debate. If the opponents make the mistake of opposing it, which they probably will, and that gets the media concerned about it. You can see where that would have a very positive effect, because we'd start to talk about these issues. And then we'll figure out from there where to go. I can see lots of things.
I had a question, which is that, do you think global peace will ever realistically be able to be achieved with the current private incentives?
I think something approximating global peace will be achieved, or we will destroy ourselves. If we keep fighting wars, it's not a question of if we'll destroy ourselves, it's only a question of when. It's the Russian roulette analogy all over again. And it doesn't matter whether the gun has 2 chambers or 600. If you keep pulling the trigger, eventually you kill yourself. If we keep having wars, eventually one of them will escalate out of control. But just as we have a police department to maintain order in our communities, we'll have some kind of military. And we cannot jump to the end state that I'd like to see us reach. The world is too dangerous, there's too much hatred. We're going to have to calm it down bit by bit by bit.
Thank you, delegates, for coming to this talk, and for everyone who asked questions and listened intently. This is a very important topic, one that we'll be studying all summer, including on our field study. So thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you again, Marty.